So we're going to go right to Sheryl, and she is going to answer the question, what is C-15, and give us some background and context on the bill. Sheryl, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Archbishop McDonald, and it is my pleasure to be with you this evening. And I just want to open and say how very honored and deeply humbled I am to appear alongside these two very distinguished co-panelists of mine. And I want to acknowledge all years of work that they have put in to get us to this stage in history. And I want to acknowledge them for all that they do and have done. Many thanks to the organizers for bringing us all together this evening. And before I begin my remarks, I also want to pay my respects to the Hunkaminam speaking Musqueam people on whose territory I live and work and enjoy their friendship and their hospitality. And I live on the UBC campus out in Vancouver, so this is their traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory, and I always want to begin with that acknowledgement. And I also want to acknowledge Mary Fontaine and thank you very much for your opening prayer this evening. Before we begin and talk about C-15 in particular, I want to take us just a few steps back in time. And I would love to give you the full history of the Declaration, but we don't have time for that. But I want to hit on a few key points about the history of the Declaration, which I think are important to bring into the conversation this evening. First and foremost, in one of the most important points to me and to my understanding of the Declaration and C-15 is that it's important to remember the deep grassroots origins of this document. The earliest pre-drafts that articulated Indigenous peoples' human rights emerged at grassroots international Indigenous gatherings back in the mid-1970s. And we could actually go back further than that into the 20s and beyond. But when we start talking about drafts of documents that eventually became the Declaration, we can squarely look in the mid-1970s, both here in British Columbia at the World Council of Indigenous Peoples gathering, and then also at one of the early treaty conferences of the International Indian Treaty Council in Standing Rock, South Dakota, both in the mid-1970s. And both of those meetings launched a movement of people who began gathering in Geneva in 1977, and in the years that followed, made the intention, a very deliberate decision to work with the United Nations and the member states there in order to develop what we now know as the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it's also important to recognize that that was a long and difficult process. It took 2 decades of negotiations with states through 2 different working groups in Geneva, and out of all of that work, the UN Declaration emerged. And that was actually, it's important to note, one of the longest discussed instruments in UN history. So this has not been an easy path by any means. It's also important to remember that this is the first human rights instrument where the rights holders themselves, Indigenous peoples, were participants in the consensus that came out of Geneva and what we now know as the Declaration. And it's important to remember, out of that 2-decade-long discussion, the Indigenous advocates at the table did not get everything that they wanted in the final draft, and neither did the UN member states. It's a compromise instrument, but it's one that everyone agreed to move forward with. Also, nothing in the Declaration is about creating new rights. Everything in this document affirms inherent pre-existing rights and builds on existing international human rights law. But the Declaration articulates human rights specifically for the context and the ongoing challenges that Indigenous peoples face all around the world. It's a rich instrument, and it affirms individual rights of Indigenous peoples as well as collective rights. And it articulates very clearly what states' responsibilities are in order to make sure that those rights are fulfilled in individual country contexts. And under the Declaration and human rights law, states are required to establish mechanisms in conjunction and collaboration with Indigenous peoples in order to resolve issues that remain on the table. And so when we look around the world, we are seeing implementation beginning to happen, and it happens in 4 general categories of form. So it's going on through the UN system and all of the UN agencies. It's happening in regional instruments like the Organization of American States, the European Union, and so forth. It's happening in court cases and judicial actions at the national and sub-national level around the world. And then it is also occurring in constitutional policy and the topic of tonight, legislative measures at the national level. So that's what we would like to talk about in particular, specifically the bill before us, C-15. And if we read the Declaration itself, Article 38 states explicitly that states, in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples, shall take the appropriate measures, including legislative measures, to achieve the ends of this declaration. So there is an expectation built right into the Declaration that there should be implementing legislation. But first, we need to touch on an earlier piece of proposed legislation, which was Private Members Bill 262, that was tabled by MP Romeo Saginash back in 2016. And that bill was a very short, sweet, and simple bill. It had 3 requirements. It asked for a review of all federal legislation to ensure that it's consistent with the minimum standards set out in the UN Declaration. Secondly, it required the federal government to work with Indigenous peoples to develop a national action plan for implementation. And then finally, it required annual reporting to Parliament on progress made towards implementation of the Declaration. And that bill, 262, was adopted by the House of Commons, and it was further supported by a unanimous motion of the House of Commons. In the end, however, it met a sad fate because the opportunity to pass this legislation was lost when it was stalled in the Senate, and it died on the order paper when the Senate rose back in June 2018. So during the last federal election, the Liberals promised to bring forth a government implementation bill next round so that a bill would have a better chance of making it through the Senate. Along the way, out here in British Columbia, again where I live, the provincial government passed UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples legislation, what we now call the Dripa Act, in November of 2019. And it did so unanimously. And that became the very first jurisdiction in the English-speaking world to have implementation legislation. And this piece of legislation, what we now unaffectionately known as the Dripa Act, was co-developed with the First Nations Leadership Council in the province. And similar to 262 on the federal level that I just spoke about, it sets out a process to align British Columbia's laws with the UN Declaration. And it does so in many similar ways to what previous 262 had done, and also shares similarities with the current bill under discussion, C-15. It mandates that the provincial government bring its laws into harmony with the UN Declaration over time, beginning with a review of laws and policies. And it requires an action plan to achieve that alignment along with annual reporting. So now, before us, we have Federal Bill C-15, which was tabled in late 2020 as a government bill. It is nearly identical in substance, both to Bill C-262 and the BC Dripa Act, but it also builds on C-262 in a few important ways. First of all, it includes a very strongly stated preamble. And there is important work that goes on in this preamble, much of which has yet to be explicitly stated in Canadian law. And personally, as an Indigenous person, I welcome some of these statements that are explicit and firmly made in the preamble. Let me just give you a few examples. The preamble affirms that the Declaration is the minimum standard for Indigenous peoples' human rights and that it must be implemented in Canada. It specifically and explicitly rejects all doctrines of superiority and rejects all forms of colonialism. It also pledges a partnership approach to implementation alongside Indigenous peoples. So those are my favorite elements of the preamble. And like the BC legislation, C-15 will align federal laws with the Declaration and calls on the government and Indigenous leaders to work collaboratively to create an action plan for implementation. And it's given us a timeline now, 3 years. Similar to the BC legislation, as well as the earlier C-262, this bill will affirm that the Declaration as a universal international human rights instrument applies to Canadian law, meaning that it can be used to interpret existing laws and to develop new legislation, but it does not automatically transform or enshrine immediately the Declaration into law. Importantly, however, it provides us a very clear process and a sensible and reasonable framework for implementation of the Declaration in this country. And I'm going to leave it there, Mark, and send it back to you. And I look forward very much to hearing from our next speakers.